Welcome to Talk World Radio, a half-hour discussion of politics as if the people mattered. I'm David Swanson. This week on Talk World Radio, we are talking about a wonderful new book called Last Radiance, Radical Lives, Bright Deaths by Karen Malpede. Here is the book for those of you watching the video. Karen Malpede is, of course, a wonderful playwright. This is not a play. This is more of a nonfiction autobiographical account. We will talk about it. Karen Malpede, welcome to Talk World Radio.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I was thinking we met during the Iraq War, and here we are on video.
In fact, the first play of yours that I read, I believe, was about the Iraq War, and I came to New York and saw it performed, and we had discussions with the public.
Yes,
right?
Yes. It was called Prophecy.
A wonderful play called Prophecy, and it struck me just in reading this book and the Iran War happening now that a lot of what was the subject of that, and you did another play about torture, is very different now. They don't even put any real effort into the lies anymore. So there's not that same material of the lying us into a war. They just don't care that we oppose it and don't even bother anymore. Am I right?
You're right. I mean, it's even worse. But Prophecy was about the moral injury to veterans, both from Iraq, because it was partly a memory play, and from the Iraq War. And as, of course, you know, more veterans have killed themselves than were killed in the Iraq War in combat. And that's the first time that's ever happened.
And I think in recent decades, in all of the U.S. wars, the top killer of U.S. troops, which is a tiny fraction of the people killed in these wars, is suicide, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I want to talk about these powerful plays, but I also want to talk about this book, Last Radiance.
Yes. Let's talk about it.
Is sort of where some of the plays come from and how they came to be created and with whom. And it starts out as some sort of autobiography, and it becomes largely biography of this larger than life hero, your beloved partner, George, right?
Yes.
What was your idea in putting this book together?
Well, when George was, short story, and there's a longer story, but when George was diagnosed with multiple myeloma in 2018, I realized that my whole life had been bracketed by cancer. My father died of cancer. That's the first chapter, which some people find quite shocking. My father was a complex man, and he died of cancer when I was 19. My dear friend Julian Beck, who occupies the second chapter, along with another good friend, Barbara Deming, two towering, very tall, very thin, towering, morally pacifist artists, also died of cancer. I was involved in both of their final works, and then George died of treatment for cancer. And when George was a diarist as well as a wonderful actor and producer. He was trying to write his early story in Nazi Germany, and he didn't get to finish it. So I wanted to finish that for him. I also wanted to memorialize these extraordinary people who I was fortunate to know very well.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book, and it is somewhat autobiographical, but it is focused largely on key people in your life, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm a playwright, so I focus on characters.
Right. But you're a character too.
I am. I'm a character too in it. I was the lucky one who got to be with these people in key moments. Yeah.
In the early pages, I mean, there are disturbing and shocking things about your family, and you sort of say that you got out of your house and got into peace activism and activism, and after that into theater. Can you talk about how that happened?
Sure. Well, my father, spoiler alert, I won't tell the whole story of the shocking first chapter, which is pretty interesting. But my father was a very good man who was overtaken by rage. 3, 4, 5 times a day, really uncontrollable rages. And it was scary living in the house. And I also saw how this very good man, responsible man, loving man, could not control his dark side, which was pretty awful and scary and frightening. So, it occurred to me that violence doesn't do anybody any good ever. And I went to the University of Wisconsin, which was with Berkeley, one of the centers of the anti-war movement, and I came quite naturally to it. The first march I was ever on, there were 30 of us marching around the state capitol in Madison, and the FBI or somebody, we thought they were at the FBI, were on the standing on the Capitol balconies taking our photos. So that was, the beginning. Oh, hi, uh,
Yeah. And my dad went to University of Wisconsin-Madison in those years as well. And you have great accounts of your early peace activism and throughout of great peace activism. But how did you come to find the theater and writing plays? And was some of that rage and other emotions in your life material for that
mhm.
career?
Absolutely. I had always wanted to be a playwright, but I didn't think women could write plays, given this was the 60s. And in my entire life through graduate school at Columbia, I never read a play written by a woman. And then, of course, I started researching plays written by women and found many. Oh, I could do this. So I studied theater literature, dramatic literature, and I studied with a Shakespearean scholar who makes a tiny appearance in the book, who gave me the office next to Jack Gelber. But he was a very renowned Shakespearean, and I studied theater literature minutely. He invited me to join his PhD seminar, and I went to that for 7 years, studying great writers in minute detail. That was I think, how I learned to write plays, or my background. And I wrote a couple books about the theater, and then I wrote my first play, which was also about cancer, actually. It was called A Lament for Three Women, and it's the story of a mother, a daughter, and a wife of different men, but they are all dying of terminal cancer. And in those years, and even today, being nuked by chemotherapy on top of having cancer in the end of your life creates, so they are in the hospital in these endless hours, and they tell each other their stories. And so it's also a feminist play. It's a wife, a mother, and a daughter relating their relationship to these men who are the most important characters in their lives, and kind of coming to sisterhood, what we would call sisterhood, in a lament for what's gone and looking forward to what is after that.
It's not, I wouldn't say it's a sad book, but grief is a big part of the book. Grief as something that becomes overwhelming toward the end of the book, but also throughout as a way that you relate to people, as a means of sympathizing with other characters, as, again, material for the theater, right?
Yeah, I say in the book that grief is love. People don't grieve if they haven't loved. And I did love all these characters in the book, and especially George. And so I wanted to write about grief. I also wanted to write about death, because the last works, Edward Said wrote his last book before he died of leukemia, was about the last works of great artists.
Right.
And he pointed out that these last works, when you're standing on a precipice between this world and whatever, shatter all kinds of formal, boundaries, but tend to be magnificent. Ibsen, Euripides, the two I know well, who he writes about, their last plays are extraordinary. So I also wanted to write about the last works of these great artists who were not playwrights. Julian was a writer. He was an actor, a director, a writer, multi-talented guy. Wonderful person, such a wonderful person. Gentle, kind. I wanted people to know about him who didn't have the privilege of knowing him as the co-founder of the Living Theater and a lifelong pacifist artist. He finished his last book of poetry in Mount Sinai Hospital a few days before he died. He toured to Europe in a Beckett play a month before he died. George was in my last play that I wrote for him with Kathleen Chalfant a year before he died. And I tell that story. We did it right after COVID, outside on a farm, in 49-degree weather in May. The weather just shifted over Memorial Day weekend. But it was an amazing performance, and it's on film. If anyone, it's on YouTube. Google Blue Valiant and Kathleen Chalfant and George Bartenieff, who are two of our great actors in New York and in America and in the world. You can watch them doing a beautiful, beautiful job.
Along with a piano as a horse.
Yes, a piano as a horse in a field on a farm.
George Bartenieff becomes the main character of this book, but you're mentioning Barbara Deming and Julian Beck and Judith Malina, and there's a number of other people who occupy what I now think of as the pre-George section of the book.
Yeah.
And these were some
Grace Paley, our night in jail in Washington, D.C.
Yes. For saying no nukes at the White House.
Yep, we stood on the White House lawn. We went on the White House tour. You could not do this today. Stepped over a little, like, fence, not a fence, a chain that you put in your driveway, like 6 feet tall, 6 inches. I'm sorry, 6 inches tall. Stepped over it, walked onto the White House lawn, unfurled the banner, and were immediately arrested. But we got a photo of that, which is an iconic photo. But at our trial, we had a 2-week trial. I don't think I talk about this in the book. We had a 2-week trial, and at our trial, the arresting officers lied. And they said, we climbed a 6-foot fence and went running across the White House lawn. And I thought, wow, if they're lying at our trial, a bunch of white peaceniks, what do they do at, other people's trials?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now they actually have that fence, and when you climb over it, they shoot you. So
exactly.
Things have changed.
Yeah.
But when somebody in the military has moral injury and they go and ask for counseling, they're often told, well, you need to find Jesus, and when you were deep in grief after the loss of George, and you went to therapy and they told you, well, you're going to see him again. and I don't think it's as if they want you to expect you to actually believe that. I don't think they actually believe that, because then all the rest of the therapy is pointless. They should focus just on that. That's enough.
Right. If I'm going to see him again, what am I doing hanging around here?
I know. Like, hurry it up. Let's go see him. If you really believed it, right?
It's a terrible thing, David. We are such a violent society, and yet we do not want to hear about grief. People say things like, get over it, or you'll see him again. I was lucky and finally found some very good friends and a good therapist and a psilocybin trip to the underworld, which I describe in some detail, that allowed me to experience my grief, which of course has changed a bit over time, but hasn't gone away. And George, you saw him act. I mean, what a remarkable, marvelous spirit he was. And when we don't talk about dying and we don't talk about grief. And I wanted to talk about both. I wanted to these are human experiences of profound meaning and depth. And George was afraid of dying, and as most of us are, of course, and all I could say to him was, you will not be alone. And he died at home in my arms, and he was not alone. The
Yeah.
last 10 days of his life were surrounded again by friends who came, and Peter Schumann, who called from Vermont, the great puppeteer, a good friend of George's and friend of mine. Uh, and death was in a way ritualized. George was writing in his diary up until a few days before he died. His last written memory is his first memory of Nazi Germany. He was born 10 days before Hitler came to power. And I use that in the book. I use parts of his diaries in the book.
Yeah, and talk about his childhood in Nazi Germany and how it was forgotten until his final years or months.
Yeah, he was, it was his brother changed his name from Igor Barteniev to John Barrett and really forgot George, I was working with Robert J. Lifton at his institute called Violence and Human Survival. And I was reading his great book, The Nazi Doctors. And George said, "Why are you always reading all this Holocaust stuff?" And I said, "Well, you're a Holocaust survivor." And he said, "No, I'm not." And at that moment, he realized he had been left in Nazi Germany for 3 years. His parents immigrated to the United States through Cuba. He was left with the wealthy non-Jewish half of his family, but one of the people in that family was a Nazi chemical factory owner who was running his chemical factory, making chemicals for the war effort, while George was living in the same house with him. And then George was sent to a Steiner school far away from Berlin, in Bavaria, for the last year. And finally, because he didn't have a birth certificate, he was born 10 days before Hitler came to power, and his parents, who were dancers, did not register his birth. So they couldn't get him out. He didn't have papers. But the family was well connected, and they managed to do this somehow. His mother came back to Germany in 1938, couldn't get the children out, didn't even see the children. But somehow the next year they got birth certificates. They went to the boat, handed the passport to the Nazi at the boat, and his father was a Russian Jew, so the name on the passport was Kahn Kogan. And the Nazi said, "This is a Jewish name, you cannot get on the boat." And his aunt, who was a Huguenot, wealthy German woman, threw a fit. "We have no Jews in our family," she screamed and yelled, putting on an act. And the boys were allowed onto the boat with a nanny. I have a photo of them looking very glum and terrified on this boat. On the boat over, they were shown anti-Semitic films after dinner for entertainment. It was the Europa. It was the last journey of this luxury liner across the ocean before the war started. So he witnessed these Nazi anti-Semitic films as a kid and had lots of nightmares. But he grew up, and then he came to New York. And so culturally, he always identified with Jewish culture in New York, but he never remembered his early years until,
But he saw the power of acting, if not lying, in that performance.
In his aunt's performance, for sure. And his mother was a well-known dancer in Germany, and Irmgard Bartenieff. There's a Bartenieff-Laban Bartenieff Institute still today. She brought Rudolph Laban's dance notation to it's an interesting family. I never met her. She died before we met. But then George and I spent 3 years of our lives adapting I Will Bear Witness, the Holocaust diaries of Victor Klemperer, into a one-person show for George, which he toured for about 5 or 6 years, and we did in New York and Washington and all in Europe, Berlin and London. And he stepped into this secular Jewish philologist, Victor Klemperer, who was a great writer, and the diary is a great diary. And he performed 52 characters, but not by mimicking them, by sort of calling them up inside as Klemperer saw them and wrote about them. It was a magnificent performance. One more thing. When Trump was elected the first time, or selected, We did a version, an early from 1933 to 39. I'm sorry, uh, yeah, from 39, from Hitler's election, those years, and we toured it to living rooms. It was a half-hour free performance about the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany and people's terror, and then we had time to discuss with the audience how they were feeling about the first presidency of our current president.
It's we're speaking with Karen Malpede, and the book is Last Radiance: Radical Lives, Bright Deaths. And the story, well, your story is a unique one, but so is that of George Martenyev. But even more unique, and you say in the book that you, as far as you know, it's unique, is the partnership of an actor and a playwright who, for decades, writes plays for principally for that actor, and it is very unique and certainly wonderful. And you put out plays and performed plays that were not just dramatic, but were also on topics of environmental destruction and women's rights and war and torture and so
The
on.
U.S. torture program, one of my favorite plays, Another Life, the U.S. about the U.S. torture program. All of these plays are published, so anyone can find them. Yeah, I just wrote my first play that's not for George because he's no longer here, and it's called Epstein Oratorio, or A Modern Hymn to Demeter. And it's also ripped from the headlines, but also from myth. And I often do that. I often collage ancient stories with modern stories to create a new story of character and they say drama is conflict, but I say drama is change. How do we change? How do we change? Hopefully for the better as we grow older, and that's what I like to dramatize.
And a lot of the results of such work are subtle and indirect and educational, but you also mention things like the Marines having to investigate the horror in their prisons after a performance by George of a prisoner in a U.S. Marines
Oh,
prison.
yes, George was in The Brig, a famous production of the Living Theater, so famous that it got the theater closed by the federal government, and they went to Europe and toured Europe for years. They lost their theater in New York. The Brig is a famous play in American theater history, although, if you weren't studying that, you may not know it. It was the day in the life of a Marine prison camp done, directed by Judith Malina, this 5'2" dynamo, and a bunch of men. And she trained them to be Marines. And the discipline in the Marine prison camp was really like being in a torture camp. I mean, they were not allowed to speak, et cetera, et cetera. And after that play was done, there was an investigation of the conditions of Marine prison camps, and the Living Theater was closed by the U.S. government. Both things happened.
Can you talk a little about the choice between doing theater that's engaged and active and living, and doing theater that's commercial? You talk about George taking parts in television shows, but generally choosing not to pursue a more commercial path.
Yeah, that's what's amazing about his career, because he was on Broadway at age 14. Of course, he was directed by Harold Clurman, who was the founder of the group theater and was a lefty himself. His next play was that he was in on Broadway at 16 was written by Lillian Hellman, who refused to testify before HUAC. So in those days, engaged political people got their plays onto Broadway. That's very rare these days because the astronomical cost of Broadway, and other reasons I would guess. So the theater, the engaged theater, as you say, which in other countries is central to the theater, here is marginalized to the downtown and the off Broadway and yeah.
What's your relationship been with reviewers and critics over the years.
Well, I tell this story, I think, in the book, the play that you did the talk back for Prophecy, the night that Noam Chomsky did the talk. Noam, a friend of mine, and I'm very sorry to see him show up in the Epstein files.
Yes, indeed.
He's in my book. A beautiful passage he wrote to me about his first wife's death is in the book, because Noam and I both agreed that our beloved ones should die at home in our arms, and Carol died in Noam's arms. And it's a very beautiful chapter. After that, I lost touch with him. He remarried, and it was only then that he got involved with, the villain of today, quite a villain, Epstein. So, which I've just written a play about, not about Noam. I've written a play about mothers and daughter. Well, a play that is horrible and beautiful at the same time. People have said, who have read it, they've gotten both of those, and I think most of my plays have that. A beauty of the language and of character, and sometimes terrible circumstances. Often terrible circumstances. Within that, what is the resistance to that? How do we resist? How do we stay human, become more human, even, as you know well in your work.
Indeed. Karen Malpede, we have about 2 minutes left. Time flies when you're talking about good art. Can you talk a little bit about our culture in terms of its seemingly little interest in ceasing to create cancer, and at the same time, its dramatic investment in the war on cancer, in curing cancer after the fact?
Yeah. Well, cancer is caused by all kinds of things, including the massive pollution, that we're subjected to, and trauma. I do believe there are multi causes of cancer, but cancer is a big business. So, there's a lot of interest in treating cancer, virtually no interest in preventing cancer. And Rachel Carson says this in Silent Spring, which I quote in my book. As she was dying of cancer, she writes in Silent Spring, "We must prevent cancer by preventing this chemical onslaught," which happened to us after the Second World War. All these chemicals had to be repurposed for domestic use. So they were repurposed to kill us from of cancer in part. And she says, so we must prevent cancer. Treatment, of course, has to go on for those who already have cancer. And she was dying of cancer, and she was viciously attacked for that book, The Silent Spring, viciously. It goes back to culture. When you're writing about a healing, what we have to do to heal, it often goes against capitalism. And therefore you're viciously attacked, and that's also true in the theater. My work, which is meant to be, I hope, very human and beautiful, and the book has been, Kathy Chalfant, who's an actor who's worked with me a lot, said about the book, it's so visual. She can see every scene, and I think that's also comes from my playwriting.
Yeah. You should get the plays by Karen Malpede and read them, and if possible, see them performed or get them performed. But you should also get this latest book called Last Radiance, Radical Lives, Bright Deaths, by our guest, Karen Malpede. Karen, thank you very much for coming on Talk World Radio.
My pleasure, David. Thank you so much.
This is Talk World Radio. I'm David Swanson. Take action at rootsaction.org. Help end war at worldbeyondwar.org. Read or listen to today's Peace Almanac entry at peacealmanac.org. All past shows can be heard at talkworldradio.org. Talk World Radio is produced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and syndicated by Pacifica Network. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.